The understated Google Nexus 6 unveiling was enough of a hint that it won't be like any other Nexus device so far. This is Daniel from PhoneArena, and we aren't talking about the pricing scheme only here. Unlike its 5-inch Nexus 5 predecessor, the Nexus 6 sports, well, you guessed it, a 6-inch display. This has made Motorola's phablet huge and unmanageable with one hand, but there are no compromises with its truly flagship specs. This is in stark contrast with the Nexus 5 crafted by LG, which was released with specs just a step below LG's flagship at the time, but at half of what Google and Motorola are charging for the 6. Which approach to the Nexus line is better? Let's compare the two generations and find out. The Nexus 6 chassis might be fairly compact for a 6-incher, as its bezels are pretty modest all around, but it still requires you to use it with two hands the vast majority of the time. It also leaves a sizable impact in your pocket, to the point that it's very uncomfortable to sit with this thing there, depending on how tight your pants are. The only thing that saves the manageability somewhat is the dimpled logo on the back, where your index finger can rest more comfortably while operating the phone. The Nexus 5, in contrast, is much more compact, not overly thin, and pretty comfortable to hold and operate with one hand. Both phones are built sturdy and look unpretentious. They are somewhat devoid of premium materials and are yet ready to withstand the tests of time and a few drops in the process too. The Nexus 5 side keys are wobblier and a tad less clicky than the metal ones on the Nexus 6, which also look more premium and are jaded with a pattern for extra grip. In sync with these types of super big screen smartphones, the Nexus 6 is equipped with a 6-inch Quad HD AMOLED panel. Needless to say, your fingers strain to reach the corners of the display, so two-handed operation should be enforced. We can't deny that its pixel density, clocking at close to 500 ppi, brings about sharp visuals for small text, icon edges and the like. But so does the Nexus 5's panel, which is a 5-inch 1080p one, returning a pixel density of 445 ppi, and this count is not a far cry from the pixel density on the Nexus 6. Frankly, the difference is indistinguishable from the Quad HD display with the naked eye. Where the Nexus 5 screen takes advantage, though, is a much higher brightness and better color presentation, while the Nexus 6 exhibits the typical for AMOLED displays oversaturated colors. The Nexus 5's LG panel is almost spot on. Its color and grayscale deviations from the reference points are also much smaller than the ones of the Nexus 6. In terms of color temperature, both handsets perform very well, hitting close enough to the white point reference, which means the colors won't look overly cold or warm. So you can go shoe shopping on both. Just keep in mind the overblown hues on the Nexus 6, as you might get something else in the mail than what you ordered on the screen. Both being Nexus devices, the phones sport the latest Android 5.0 Lollipop build with all the flat and minimalistic material design it brings, and all the under-the-hood improvements, like a new kernel and native 64-bit support. The interface runs smooth on both handsets without noticeable lag and hiccups, and moves in a typical fluid stock Android fashion. Of course, there are all the cool new features of Lollipop. We're not going to rehash all of them, just we'd say that we're very pleased to see support for multiple users, something we had on Android tablets for a while now, and with Android 5.0 this is the first time smartphones are being given access to the feature. Considering that we're dealing with a phablet-like device here with the Nexus 6, it is missing certain elements that take full advantage of this huge screen real estate. There are no one-handed modes, no split-window multitasking, not even scooching the keyboard, dialer or calculator, for example, left to right to help with typing with one hand. Courtesy of Lollipop, both handsets sport a neat new feature called Ambient Display. It lights up the screen automatically when you pick up the phone or when you receive a notification, which is time-saving if it's lying next to you on the table, but can be turned off at will. The battle of the chipsets is not a fair one here, as the Nexus 6 comes equipped with a quad-core 2.7 GHz Snapdragon 805, coupled with the beefy 3 GB of RAM. Nexus 5 steps 2 CPU generations back, donning a 2.3 GHz Snapdragon 800 and 2 GB of RAM. Frankly, since both are running the light and flat stock Android interface, they both feel fast and fluid in everyday usage. The Nexus 6 models come with either 32 GB or 64 GB of internal storage, while Nexus 5 starts you off with 16, and you can pay extra for a 32 GB option. Both are lacking microSD slots for storage expansion though, so pick wisely. Chrome's functionality with the two phones hasn't greatly changed with Lollipop, so the experience is for the most part identical to any other Android smartphone running the browser. Lollipop introduces the option of having individual page tabs appear in the app switcher as separate entities. Overall, there is nothing too out of the ordinary here. We're presented with fast page loads, instant page rendering, and that tight feel with the navigational controls. The Nexus 6 and 5 are available in two versions, one for the US market and another for the rest of the world. The US model of the Nexus 6 offers support for 12 AT bands, while the Nexus 5 makes do with 9. And the international version of the Nexus 6 goes up to 10 bands with 6 for the Nexus 5. The handsets also support up to 42 megabits per second HSPA plus download speeds, if your carrier can't provide those, of course. Both units are armed with the usual set of connectivity features we'd expect to find, like assisted GPS, Bluetooth, dual-band Wi-Fi and NFC. Needless to say, one big advantage of the huge Nexus 6 display over the 5-incher of the Nexus 5 is media consumption, as pictures, video and games just look and feel much better on a larger screen. As for the pixel density, that's of a dubious advantage, as it's unlikely you'll go through the trouble to dig out a 2K video just to watch it in native resolution, as the difference will be close to invisible to the naked eye. Motorola's phone, however, flaunts an AMOLED display whose blacks are really deep compared to the slightly grayish looking ones on the LCD panel of the Nexus 5, which makes a difference while watching darker scenes in movies, for instance. However, you also need to have luck on your side when picking a Nexus 6 unit, since some of those suffer from inaccurate color reproduction. As for codec support, the phones play most popular formats you throw at them without any issues. The tune players are identical, using Google's stock Play Music app, which is pretty devoid of anything other than the basic features. Another media consumption point for the Nexus 6 are its two stereo speakers at the front, while the Nexus 5 is equipped with one loudspeaker only, and a pretty wimpy one at that. The 13-megapixel camera of the Nexus 6 features optical image stabilization, dual LED flash ring, and up to 4K video recording. The Nexus 5 answers with quite a modest 8-megapixel shooter and optical image stabilization in its turn, able to master 1080p video recording only. The snapping app on both phones is Google's camera, that's been available in the Play Store for a while, and we can see Wallapop's favor of offering a cleaner interface, since the camera app UI is predominantly reserved for the viewfinder now. In terms of shooting modes, we're given Photosphere, Panorama, HDR+, and Lens Blur. Outdoors, both handsets take pretty decent photos, even in not so ideal lighting conditions. They often mess up the white balance measurements though, casting an overly warm, yellowish hue over the scene in the case of the Nexus 5, or leaning to the colder side of the spectrum somewhat with the Nexus 6. The Motorola phablet exposure is largely spot on, while its predecessor often chooses an exposure setting that is a step under what it should be. The Nexus 6 also captures a bit more detail than the Nexus 5. The Nexus 6 performs so well in terms of color presentation indoors, but the shots seem a tad too dark, and it introduces a bit too much noise in the frame too. Indoors, the Nexus 5 fares well. It achieves decent exposure without washing it out too much, and the white balance issues from outdoors don't translate in low light. Its flash is very weak though, when compared to Nexus 6, and illuminates the scene quite unevenly as well. Motorola's phone is capable of 4K video, while the Nexus 5 maxes out at 1080p footage. The Nexus 6 video is very fluid, and the optical image stabilization makes the scene just flow in front of the lens. The color presentation is slightly colder than reality, while the overly warm tones from the Nexus 5 make the video yellowish to the point of unpleasantness. The Nexus 6 overall exposure is also better than what the Nexus 5 spits out, as it makes the video brighter, and exposure compensation while panning around is faster too. Continuous autofocus works like a charm on the phablet, while we wish you good luck trying to focus back and forth with the Nexus 5. The Nexus 5 also tends to produce a rather unpleasant sound recording, especially when you're shooting in a noisy location. With the Nexus 6, things sound a whole lot better. Both phones record sound in mono, unlike plenty of current handsets that record stereo. The Nexus 6 is no longer the value for money subsidized limited availability endeavor we've come to expect from Google's handset line, Nexus 5 included. It is a full-blown flagship with the latest bells and whistles, available on all carriers, but with a price tag that is almost twice that of the Nexus 5 at launch. Naturally, it is a much better phone than the Nexus 5 specs-wise, with a larger pixel-dense display, faster chipset, double the storage out of the box, and a much better camera capable of 4K video recording. Another very important advantage is that its battery lasts now about 50% more than the weak Nexus 5 juicer. All of these combined might warrant doubling the price for you, but only if you're willing to forego the comfortable palm-friendly chassis of the Nexus 5 for this giant Nexus 6 body, which not only requires you to almost always use it with two hands, but also leaves a sizable impact in your pocket purse and on your wallet too. This was a video comparison between the Nexus 6 and the Nexus 5 from PhoneArena. For more information about these and other handsets, you can visit us at PhoneArena.com. Thanks for watching.